Have you ever heard of a morally upright and competent prison chief? Yeah, me neither. They're known to be corrupt, abusive, and power-hungry with little regard for the very people they're supposed to be serving. But what if there was a way for us to imagine how prison could be run well? How convicts may be taken care of effectively? For several years, even the nation of justice itself could only imagine what that would look like. But ever since Duke Wriothesley, whatever, why bother with British names? Ever since he took up his post as the administrator of the Fortress of Meripede, Fontaine Society probably now has higher expectations for the conduct of prison managers. So today, I'm going to explore Wriothesley's character in the context of his job and how he gives us the opportunity to show consideration for a marginalized sector of society that's very easy for uncritical people to look down on. I did already do an exploration of the job of a warden in an older video of mine, which I recommend you check out because it has a very insightful take about prison problems. However, what this video can add to my previous work is the additional consideration of Wriothesley's leadership style, his reputation, and his possible involvement in the new Archon quests for the next patch. But before I dive underwater to survey the Fortress of Meripede, I'd like to invite you guys to subscribe to my channel if you think these kinds of analyses would be of interest to you. Now, just to make sure we're on the same page, because in my last video, I made the assumption that people generally know what Wriothesley's job entails, but the stuff I saw online made me realize, no, people don't really know what he does. I say this because he's often depicted arresting people on the streets, similar to someone like maybe Sino. They make him put people in jail, but it's not really like that. Instead, he's the one likely to be receiving people who have been sentenced by the court already. So imagine a pipeline of arrest, trial, and incarceration. The problem is people sometimes categorize Wriothesley under the first part, which is arrest, whereas he should come into the picture only at the latter stage. He's not like, aha, I have caught you in the act of committing a crime. I shall have you punished by the law. Instead, he'd be like, welcome to your new home for 5 years in the Fortress of Meripede. So yeah, basically, he has a largely different function in society, and this is the first time we'll see any type of prison manager or equivalent as a playable character in Genshin, which has a totally different implication from being your typical law enforcement officers like the Knights of Favonius, the Millelith, the Tenryo Commission, or the Matra. Because while characters from these factions make us feel a sense of triumph once the criminals have been caught, they don't often let us know what happens to them after that moment, whereas this is the main focus of Wriothesley's character, the destiny of criminals and why we should care about such a thing. It's very unusual for a prison chief to bear a noble title, but if you think about how the Fortress of Meripede was described in the live stream, with the place seeming like a secluded micro-society, Duke Wriothesley ends up being almost like a mayor, because he doesn't just manage prisoners' mobility or rule adherence, he looks after an entire system of social interactions. This is not only atypical for his job description, but it shows how revolutionary his approach is and how much more effort he puts into his job than past Fortress admins would have done. Perhaps this stems not only from his diligence, but his rather unique beliefs about prisoners, as shown in his quote displayed in his drip marketing. He says, "You've got the wrong end of the stick. They just wanted somewhere to lead well-ordered lives, and I gave them the tranquility they required." It's pretty interesting because we'd commonly think of convicts as unruly people who are drawn to evil and chaos, who have a disregard for pro-social behaviors, which is why they simply need to be locked up to be kept away from the rest of us as punishment. And yet Wriothesley counters this idea by suggesting that, hey, What if convicts are people who actually desire a peaceful life just like the rest of us do? What if instead of forcing them to learn how to act morally, we can somehow induce their natural goodness to come out? So my interpretation of his line is that Wriothesley likely took on his job with the mission to create an environment that would be conducive to the prisoner's personal development. And doing that is insanely tough, which is why someone who doesn't have a strong political will wouldn't even attempt that. But Wriothesley does for some reason have that will, which is why he had the guts to reimagine what prison could look like and what it could mean to the convicts residing there. Basically, I do think lots of the reforms Wriothesley put in place really resulted from his respect for prisoners, which again is, have you seen that in real life? Like, ever? And I would surmise that some of his management skills also stem from a decent understanding of human psychology, like what motivates people to follow rules, what conditions you can create to stimulate better work performance, how you can cultivate interpersonal trust among individuals. Kinda like nudge theory almost, which is like a part of behavioral economics and cognitive psychology aimed towards subtly influencing people's choices. Maybe I'm giving him too much credit for his management or making it seem more big-brained than it actually is, but I think his job wouldn't have been as effective if he didn't use at least a few nudging tools. Interestingly, aside from punishment systems such as reprimands and confiscation, he might also create systems for incentivizing certain behaviors, as either punishment or reward can be more effective depending on the scenario. However, of course, we have yet to see exactly how he goes about dealing with difficult people through social-emotional means. I did say in my previous video that Wriothesley might be either likable or threatening, with me leaning towards guessing he'd be more on the likable side when it comes to interacting with inmates. However, a sort of third option that I failed to consider is that he appears respectable in such a way that even if he's not exactly chummy with prisoners, he can come across as trustworthy or reliable enough for the inmates to feel inclined to follow him. If he's strict in a reasonable way and has shown time and time again that he follows his word of honor and looks out for your well-being, then you'd naturally be inclined to believe that following his directives will be beneficial to you in the end. It's not just that they have respect for him because he's an authority figure, but probably because they do genuinely believe in him. I think this guess that he projects a sense of respectability is backed up by the stellar reputation he enjoys, which, as I keep saying, is extremely unusual for prison chiefs. But it's definitely a testament to the degree of his effectiveness that goes beyond only his position of authority. It is possible to hold a lot of power yet not be well regarded. So the fact that he is well regarded says a lot, especially with convicts wanting to stay in prison longer than their sentences dictate, likely because they found a sense of community and acceptance in the fortress that is largely difficult to come across outside its confines. It makes you wonder how bad the outside world might be when it comes to properly ensuring everyone's well-being. What if certain aspects of Fontaine society, like maybe the socio-economic inequalities present, might push people to criminality even if they wouldn't go that far under different circumstances? Well, of course, criminality is a result of a combination of various factors, so we can't only pin it on environment and upbringing, but it may play a part in it somehow, which is why, like I said, I think what Wriothesley attempts to do is help give inmates a society that potentially serve them better than overworld Fontaine would do. However, it's gonna be highly unlikely that Wriothesley's nudges or charisma work on every single prisoner, and the most dangerous ones are likely to be the most unreasonable as well. Hence, he's been known to resort to different means to resolve these issues. Now, I would like to say that I highly condemn violence being wielded by prison authorities to instill discipline, but I'd like to go over certain circumstances in which they might be very difficult to avoid to contextualize Wriothesley's possible behavior so we can assess the situations better. The devs introduced his combat abilities in a very strange manner, describing the prisoners he exerts physical force on as uncooperative. Now, the problem with that term is it makes it seem like he punches people for, not going to bed at 11 o'clock p.m. But this is highly incongruent with his reputation of being highly respected, and someone who behaves like this would make inmates want to avoid him instead of, extending their stay at the fortress. Thus, I think what the devs meant by uncooperative prisoners are the types who are literally holding a knife with its blade being 1 millimeter away from someone's torso. People who are already in the act of committing violence against their fellow inmates and need to be physically compromised from doing so immediately, lest you risk greater casualties. In this sense, the force is not exerted after the fact, but rather in the moment to quickly cut off threats. Recall how Neuvillette quickly jumped in to neutralize Foul Legacy Child as a swift response to a dire situation, and it's something he wouldn't do to Tartaglia if he wasn't being an active threat to the opera epiclese and its audiences. In a similar light, I highly doubt Wriothesley would be hitting people as a punishment for their misdeeds after the fact. He might likely resort to implementing restraints instead, as it would be more effective. It must be worth noting that the demo of his combat talents looked insanely horrible because his moveset involves him punching rapidly as if he were attacking a punching bag, which is good because it's effective for gameplay. However, in the demo, they were making him use his skills against a prison mob who flailed about like a rag doll without any defense. But it's worth noting that this form of combat is probably not canon compliant, like with how Dia is canonically very strong and defeats fellow eremites with ease, while her actual kit leaves much to be desired. Also, Neuvillette attacked Tartaglia without using his special water cannon charged attack, right? So it could mean that Wriothesley's actual canonical method of dealing with unruly prisoners physically would be much more swift and much less painful compared to the series of punches depicted in his normal and charged attacks. If he needs to knock a weapon out of someone's hand, he just needs to quickly disarm them without bruising the rest of their body. However, this is also still just speculation, so I really hope we get answers on this from the actual cutscenes because this will inform us about his actual conduct. I'm just preempting you guys now so we can have a sort of expectation beforehand. Also, as a side note, I'm not really that fond of his handcuff idol because idol animations are supposed to be funny, cute, pretty, or cool. So I think the devs ended up unintentionally trivializing the usage of handcuffs by turning it into an idol animation because in real life, encountering handcuffs can be very threatening to people, especially those from marginalized groups who risk arrest disproportionately. Even though Wriothesley doesn't arrest people, the idol animation likely still invokes that kind of scenario. Granted, I think it's realistic for someone like Wriothesley to have access to handcuffs and fidget with them. I even think he's kinda like Pavloving the inmates to make them remember to behave when he does the fidgeting, because that kind of symbolic persuasion can be effective, and it's worth noting that he always keeps his handcuffs at the end of his idol. However, it's just weird to have it as an idol animation because it seems like handcuffs are being glamorized instead of taken seriously. But that's just my take and just a little perspective for us future Wriothesley havers to consider when engaging with his idol animation. Again, I will note that violence or force should ideally never be used against prisoners, so I hope that Wriothesley will only wield it in acts of self-defense or defense of other inmates, and it should never be used in isolated cases or as a follow-up punishment. Therefore, it is our duty as his fans to keep an eye out for these things to hopefully give a better assessment on his managerial prowess over the Fortress of Meripede, since his character provides us with a good opportunity to engage with these social political issues that may feel far removed from us in real life. Hopefully, we can try to both understand where he's coming from while also condemning certain actions if they violate our moral principles, although it doesn't have to mean that he's a despicable person either. Do remember that the general impression prisoners have on him is overwhelmingly positive. And that impression of him is something we can test firsthand when we as the traveler gain a false conviction from Neuvillette, meriting us a ticket to the Fortress of Meripede, where we'll have the opportunity to witness Duke Wriothesley's governance. Interestingly, it seems like he's being set up almost like this villain we have to conquer, but based on the first two acts of the Fontaine Archon quest and his reputation, it's likely that the situation is much more nuanced and we won't be on opposing sides for long. It's just that, as his drip marketing states, he makes infiltrators get swallowed up like breadcrumbs in a bowl of soup. Likely because these infiltrators are people he views as threats to the well-being and safety of the prisoners he's taking care of, especially if the infiltrators aren't actually convicts, so they're not meant to be there. I think we will likely end up convincing Wriothesley that our objective isn't to threaten the security of the Fortress of Meripede, so he might warm up to us after we showcase a certain amount of sincerity, perhaps. Additionally, people are speculating that this plan sort of pits Neuvillette and Wriothesley against each other, with Wriothesley apparently confronting Neuvillette about what justice truly means. However, I'm not actually completely sure if that voice was Wriothesley's, since the quality of that voice in the Korean dub, the dub I listened to, sounds rather different from Wriothesley's voice. Besides, even if he did actually say that, I think it's not purely motivated by anger, since back in patch 4.0, we also heard Navia confronting Neuvillette in the trailer, but in the actual Archon quest, the interaction was much more nuanced and heartfelt. And we should take note of the fact that there have already been 2 pieces of artwork featuring Wriothesley visiting Neuvillette in his office, indicating that they do have a somewhat close cooperative working relationship. The preview page artwork even features them meeting at night, so it might mean they have secret plans, indicating some sort of shared wavelength. Therefore, we can't take a few little details out of context, and we'll have to see how they actually interact in the game first before we pit them against each other right away. And with that said, we also have to be cautious about imagining Wriothesley's position in the story relative to ours, since we can't fully tell to what degree our camps will be in opposition. We'll just have to wait and see. So with all that said, what's the point of this preemptive analysis? Well, the thing about the narrative of Genshin Impact is that it presents a huge emphasis on the concept of governance, with us having to explore how each nation is governed by their heads of state and their archons, and even how the heavenly principles govern Tevat. As such, it makes sense that we have to explore the dynamics of how a prison system is governed and hold it up to standards of good governance, even though it might be hard for the general public to care about convicted criminals. They are still people at the end of the day, and they do definitely deserve a leader who has their best interests in mind, especially when it comes to protecting their human rights. With that in mind, it's a challenge for us to experience the 4.1 Archon Quest acts and story quests, then try to evaluate Wriothesley's leadership skills for us to better understand what good governance may or may not look like, especially when it comes to managing a marginalized sector of society. Now, going back to the question I posed at the start of this video, have you ever heard of a morally upright and competent prison chief? Perhaps Wriothesley might make us cite his name as one example, or maybe even after spending time with him, he may not still pass the cut for us, and that's okay. I think Wriothesley's purpose may not necessarily be to present us with an ideal prison administrator, but to at least raise the bar so we can compare our real-life prison managers to higher standards of ethics and competence to ensure that they treat our fellow citizens well, even if they previously committed crimes. Of course, that's easier said than done, because prison chiefs are usually appointed, just like Duke Wriothesley was. So it's not like their being in that position is in our control, but maybe we can become more active in advocating for prisoners somehow by expressing our concerns with their current administration and possibly providing direct assistance to them. Basically, I think the importance of Wriothesley's character greatly lies in his ability to make us care more about a sector of society in ways that we might not have thought of before. So I hope that meeting or even having him in our character inventory can help us become more socially aware to some extent. With all that considered, I hope you've become more interested in Duke Wriothesley, and hopefully I was able to share some valuable insights with you all. If you like this pre-release take, I hope you could consider subscribing to my channel, where I make lots of analysis videos like this one that are very character lore oriented with a touch of social commentary. That's all for today, and I'll see you in the next one.